Well, thanks everyone for being here for this talk. I have this thing, it doesn't actually work, but I will use it for hecklers in the crowd, this laser pointer. My name is Ashar, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Blameless. And so today we're gonna focus this discussion on, how do you actually build a culture of continuous improvement? And really, all of us are kind of bought into this notion of postmortems. We do postmortems in some shape or form or capacity. But there's challenges. Right, it's a very emotional topic, quite frankly, because it's so rife with toil. So it evokes this emotional response of just frustration and anger. Well, hopefully, after today's conversation, after today's talk, you'll kind of get to see how to get more out of those postmortems, make them less painful to do, and we'll look at case studies across some 300 plus companies, that we've talked to in the industry. Great. So I want to. Disclaimer here, this is not a Postmortem 101 conversation. My assumption here is folks have either read the Google SRE book or have been practicing postmortems, understand the basics of postmortems. We're going to be going into some advanced concepts, assuming that you already have some mechanism of postmorteming in place. However, we will do a quick recap. Okay. Reliability is the most important feature of your product or system. Show of hands of people who disagree with this statement. Two? Oh, wow. I disagree with you. Reliability is the most important feature of your system. If your system is not reliable, your users will leave. And I'm going to show you how. Let's look at a real life example. Bad experiences hurt businesses. So I picked Uber. It used to be Uber and Lyft, and I was like, okay, you have Uber and Grab, but then Grab kicked out Uber. It could still kind of work as an analogy, but let's see if it kind of sticks. What I want to illustrate here is when you have bad experiences, it really hurts your users. In today's world, where it's so easy for consumers to switch, the switching cost is so low from one product to the other, and how even the slightest blips in bad experiences can, have a pretty detrimental impact on your brand or, revenue. So if I pull out my phone, I pull up the Uber app, and I put in a destination. Within a span of a few minutes, I've got, this complex set of API interactions that are happening. In a few minutes, not even a few minutes, excuse me, a few seconds, I've got a driver that's been synced up for me. I'm going to come pick me up, and I'm on my way. Now, what happens if that takes anything longer than that few seconds? What have our brains been trained in the last few years to do when something like that happens? Well, you either refresh. Well, in this case, you're going to get refresh a couple of times. Well, that doesn't work. You're going to swipe your phone up or press the home button, a couple more swipes, pull up the Grab app, and just repeat the process. Right? That's how easy it was for me to go from what seemingly to the folks at Uber, which is a large company, they're like, oh, wow, we put so much effort into this application. It's so complex. It's like, as a user, I don't care. It was just poor experience. I'm just going to switch to somebody else. Right? So how do we actually prevent this? Well, that's why we're all here. That's why we're at SREcon. SRE helps you move fast without breaking things. Right? But let's actually focus today's talk on a very fundamental principle within SRE, which is blameless postmortems. So this picture is actually quite near and dear to me. It has a lot of soul and depth in it. I'll talk a little bit about why. Right? A lot of us may have experienced this. If you've been in SRE, you've been in operations, you've been some sort of IT operations for any meaningful period, you have experienced this, where the development environment is considered identical to production, right? We're going to, a change has been tested in dev, so it's good to go, so we're going to push this change. And if it works, pat on the back development team. If it doesn't work, not my problem, right? And we're going to, this picture really demonstrates mindset, right? Which is, if you look into this girl's eyes, look into her soul. It's like pure evil. And sometimes I imagine, this evil development workplace, dev and ops kind of separate together, these silos that exist and this culture of contention that exists between folks that kind of creates this environment. I know I'm kind of doing a lot of psychoanalysis on this meme here, but it really was near and dear to me. So let's do a quick show of hands here around agreement and disagreement, just to kind of test some of our understanding, or at least basics of like, do we kind of agree on the value of postmortems, right? So show of hands, agree. Postmortems help you increase resiliency. Great, great, excellent. Show of hands, this is a little tricky. Postmortems help you ship faster. Agree, disagree? Okay, great. I see only 50%, maybe less than 50% of the room. I'll try and convince you else in a different direction. Postmortems actually help you uncover some unseen insights. Great. Okay, wonderful. Kind of, okay. Some complicated, advanced postmortem practitioners. And finally, postmortems, if done well, create a collaborative and blameless culture. Maybe I should have caveated the last ones as well. I just realized. Great. Well, look, good enough. I think we have some of the basics down here. But in summary, what we'll talk about, like postmortem is what you'll see and what we've seen is actually very nuanced, right? Every company brings its own DNA to this postmortem process, which is why you don't kind of see this 100% show of hands going up, which is completely understandable. But in principle, in essence, if you do these well, right, you will build more reliable systems. You will get important insights, things that you probably haven't seen before. You may discover things that may be causing issues in some other part of the business or other part of the system that you just weren't even aware of in the past, right? You will continuously innovate. And I'll tell you why. Here's why I think we move faster. What happens if you don't do a postmortem? You have an incident and you don't do a postmortem. What ends up happening? You're probably going to run into that same issue again, right? When you run into the same issue again, what is that? It's the same set of folks, your engineering resources, your product resources, that are taking their time out of feature velocity, out of new features, that are going back and trying to fix the same thing again and again and again, right? So what's the definition of trying to do the same thing again and again and expecting different results? It's the C word. I won't say it, but we know what it is. Windows. Thank you, Windows. So doing postmortems, if you do them well, you identify your issues, you track them, you will actually end up moving faster, right? And this is actually a benefit that we don't quantify as much, this last one here. I think that's one of the biggest challenges in the industry. It's like, how do we reward, how do we measure, the collaborative aspect or the blamelessness aspect of doing blameless postmortems? Well, what I can tell you is that blameless postmortems, if done well, help create a culture of psychological safety. And psychological safety, this is a study done by Google, right? And we've experienced it in the field as well. If you have psychological safety, you will hire and retain the best talent in that company. You will have people that are going to collaborate with each other, and the best ideas are going to come out, right? This is hard to measure, but I can guarantee you that if you do this well, you will experience this benefit. Okay, so what happens if you don't do postmortems at all, then also don't do them well? So deployments, changes may or may not work, right? Because you're not learning from them. You still don't have a good understanding of what's breaking and why it's breaking. So you're not going to be moving faster. Your deployments will actually slow you down, right? Because they'll be breaking. You may have fires that you're not even aware of that are kind of popping up in your environment, right? And only when things get bad enough are these things going to pop up, and suddenly it's a code red, everybody is in this P0 incident situation trying to resolve this thing as quickly as possible, right? This is my favorite one. This is something that, one of the things I like about this one is because anytime you assign a dollar value to something, it really lights up the C-suite folks' eyes. They're like, oh yeah, I can see why this is such a waste. Well, how many folks here, have folks here ever had a parking ticket? Someone? Okay, great. Do you like paying parking? Anybody like paying parking tickets? So when you don't do postmortems well, you run into repeat incidents. You're doing the same thing over and over again. It's like paying a party. It's a complete waste of time, money, energy, resources, right? For the same issue that's happening over and over again. So that's why, if you don't do them, if you can quantify them, you can put a dollar value associated with them, you'll be able to see, it'll be eye-opening when you realize that an incident that was seemingly small is costing us $10,000 a minute, just because of the resources that are involved in that incident. Great. So now we'll go into a little bit more of the meat of the conversation here. So how do we actually get more out of our postmortems? So we're assuming that we're bought into this concept of postmortems. I don't want to say we love them yet. Hopefully by the end of this, you're going to say, I love doing postmortems. I have no excuses not to do them. But we buy into them. We understand their importance. So how do we actually get more out of them? So we'll look at some case studies, right? We've talked to over 300 companies of all varying shapes and sizes, mostly mid-size to large enterprises, Fortune 500 companies, financial services institutions, Fortune 500 retailers, and a few small startups as well. And if you don't fall into one of those categories, it's perfectly okay. Because what we found is that a lot of the concepts, a lot of the practices, no matter where you are as a company, no matter what stage you're at, you can apply them as part of your practices. Here's just a sample screenshot of some of the companies that we've talked to. We've got a cloud provider, Fortune 500 retailer, fast-growing hyper-growth startups, some smaller consumer startups, and so on. Okay, let's do another quick survey here, just so that we can all situate ourselves. So, show of hands for folks that don't do postmortems today in any shape or form. Any type of retrospective, any type of problem management. Wow, so 100% of this room does postmortems, which is excellent. How many folks like doing them? Except the folks at Google and LinkedIn. No, just kidding. Okay, not that many hands up, that's great. Why? Because they're painful, they're toil intensive, they're too closely tied to our emotions, right? They evoke some sort of emotional response in us, right? For the folks that do postmortems today, happy or unhappy, do you like the current state of your postmortem process? Agree, or show of hands for folks that like their postmortems and how they're done. One, that's one person in the room. Okay, so this is clearly a painful problem, clearly important, so we've got to figure out how to solve it. How many folks here would like for this to get better? Excellent, great. It would be weird if you're not happy with them but don't want them to get better. It's just like, I just don't ever want to do them, make this problem go away, automate all my deployments, 100% uptime, 100% change velocity. Okay, great. So this is just a rough estimate of us talking to all of these companies, and I'm sure some of you fall into this well. Some of you will do some of these, but a typical postmortem process, plus or minus 10, 15% here, is that when an incident gets resolved, you have some ownership associated with the postmortem, right? You'll complete some timeline, add some key details, add context to the postmortem. You will schedule a meeting, right? In most cases, actually, let me pause here. How many folks do postmortems synchronously via a meeting? Get together in a meeting room, let's talk about the postmortem. Okay, kind of, somewhat. How many folks do it asynchronously, which is like, oh, I'm just going to create this document. Some folks do both. Okay, great, excellent, love hearing that. So schedule a meeting, create a document, share it out with other folks. During that meeting, we will discuss the timeline elements. We'll do the analysis of the postmortem, may or may not have the right folks in this meeting. We're just like, oh, let's just invite everybody. This was a large enough incident, or we don't really know who to invite, but let's get them in. Let's actually discuss this postmortem and create follow-up action items, right? Well, let me ask this question. How many folks here do like 1 hour postmortem reviews roughly for those synchronous? Is that usually sufficient? Sometimes, yeah, this is the answer I'm seeing, which is expected, right? There's so much, when you're doing an analysis, there's so much depth, there's so much complexity, especially in a complex environment, complex system, there's so many interactions happening, an hour is usually not enough, right? So now once you've kind of created this initial draft of the postmortem, you create these follow-up action items. And we'll talk a little bit more about where this next part fits in, which is actually completing those follow-up actions. Do you consider a postmortem complete when number 4 is done, or do you consider a postmortem complete when inclusive of number 5 is done, right? So that's really the question that we'll kind of talk about a little bit here, but you'll complete these follow-up action items depending on the complexity and priority. Some of these can take days or weeks or sometimes even months. Sometimes it could be just a very large project, right? And then the final piece here is the actual publishing and sharing of the postmortem. So let me ask this question. How many folks here do a good job of publishing and sharing postmortem so the rest of the company can learn? Some of the advanced folks here, I see Google and LinkedIn. Anybody else who's not Google or LinkedIn? Sir, what company are you with? ServiceNow. Excellent. Great. Fairly advanced practices. But one of the things that I want to call out here is that this gets overlooked, but it's probably one of the most important things for your company. If you can, there's so much knowledge and power in those postmortems. If you can unlock those and start sharing it with the rest of your company, the other teams, I think it really unlocks a lot of development velocity potential, reliability potential that you're just not tapping into. Let's actually talk about roughly the time consumption. Like, why is this so painful, right? Incident gets resolved, you can come up with a timeline, assign ownership to somebody, usually within a couple hours, maybe a day at most, maybe a couple days, right? It gets a little bit more painful when you're trying to do this synchronously via a meeting, because you may have multiple individuals and multiple teams involved. Now you got to figure out where their schedules fit in. Once you're in there, you have a discussion, you can create these follow-up action items. But the largest amount of time, I would actually say, is in this section here, which is doing the actual postmortem and analysis, plus publishing and sharing and completing those follow-up action items. That's where a lot of the toil goes in, right? It's not that hard to assign ownership, quite frankly. It's not that hard to come up with the timeline of things that happen, right? It does get hard when you're trying to collaborate people and corral them all into one place together and trying to prioritize with everybody having different things that they're working on, right? And then figuring out how to actually follow up on those things. Okay, great. So, again, roughly, successful postmortems. If you want to do these well, here are some of the elements that you need to take away from today's discussion. Right. Successful postmortems have ownership. They have the right context and key details about the incident, key metrics, MTTR, MTTA, MTT something, right? Whatever your metrics are. They are completed on time. That's actually extremely critical, right? If you're dragging your feet with postmortems, you're going to have this pile of postmortems, never going to get done. That learning is never going to go back into your institution, and you're going to run into the same issues again. Now, what's the point of creating follow-up action items if you're just not going to do them? Are you just doing it to check a box? Right? So you got to track these action items. You got to create them, track them, and then actually do them. You got to commit to doing them. Right? Blameless postmortems have blameless language. This is a really interesting one and near and dear to me. And we'll talk about how cultural and geographical differences actually impact the nature of blameless language, right? And of course, referenceability. How do you actually take that data in that postmortem? What's the point of writing this postmortem, storing it in some file share server somewhere, never ever accessing it again? Right? Having the ability to search, index, and reference that data is actually extremely critical. Okay, so we'll start off with, now it got, right. Was I loud enough before? I hope. Okay, great. Sorry. So let's look at a case study that we did with a mid-sized SaaS tech company. It's a pretty broad category, and it's meant to be that way because a lot of folks will fit into that, right? Okay, so ownership. Why is ownership sometimes hard, right? It can be challenging because roles and responsibilities are not clearly defined. Who's supposed to be on call? Who owns this postmortem? Okay, we have an incident command team. They should do the postmortem because they seem to have all of the context, right? The other reason why ownership is hard, and this is where psychological safety comes in. Now, if you have a culture in your company where you have silos, you're very protective of your work, when something breaks, you're not going to want to take ownership of that, right? So psychological safety, I think that's the #1 key takeaway, is identify that and take away and understand whether you have that. And if you don't, what you're going to find is that blame is getting passed around like hot potato. Oh, it wasn't me, so it wasn't my service, it wasn't my product, so I don't have anything to do with this. I have other stuff on my plate. I'm not going to actually work on this postmortem. And the other reason is that, again, finding these owners, it's not just finding these owners, but actually doing the postmortem exercise is actually toil, right? You want to ship cool features. You're like, oh man, I want to see all these usage graphs go up for these really, cool features that I'm building. Why am I being asked to do postmortems? I just don't want to do it. I'm just going to kind of brush it. I'll have an intern who's going to come in. I'm going to make the intern do it. Or only when my boss comes and yells at me is when I'm going to do it. Okay. Let's try this. Would anybody willing to share how or what they do in their company to assign ownership? Actually, let me make this a little bit narrower scope. Now, does ownership go to a centralized team, maybe an incident command team, or is ownership usually associated or attached to the service owner, the person who built the product? Or is there some other model? Anybody want to volunteer? Yes. Service ownership. This is a gentleman from Google. Great. Anybody else? Anybody here that have a centralized team that does either problem management? Great. You've got gentlemen from ServiceNow.
We have a team that runs problem management, but ultimately the ownership gets assigned back to the service owners or the applications owners.
Great. Would that be, let me ask a clarifying question. So the gentleman here, and which company are you with, sir? DBS. The gentleman from DBS said that we have a centralized problem management team that runs the process, but the ownership of the action items gets assigned to
the individual application team or
who writes the postmortem in this case?
whoever gets the owner.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so we have process ownership, and then we have the actual ownership around writing the postmortem. So those are the two models that we've seen, which are pretty consistent across the board. Anybody else here have seen something completely different that we haven't talked about? No? Yes, please.
I think it depends because you have a service owner who might have lots of the context, like you don't actually know. Maybe they do most of the changes to the service, but you have the on-caller who might have handled the instance, who knows from end to end everything about the instance. At the same time, you might have other people who don't own the service, who was not on call at the time, but did the change. So the context is everywhere. So I think writing postmortem is a process like multiple people are involved, and who is the owner, it really depends on the situation.
That's really great. So let me see if I captured that accurately. You have folks that are the service owners that are involved in this incident for the application where the change was actually made. You have folks that are on call that not necessarily related to the change that were involved in the actual incident, right, but have the full context of the actual incident itself. And then you have folks that were not involved in either one of those things, but were the ones that were actually pushing out the change, right? That's a great use case, and I think what this is going to touch on is the importance of bringing the right folks together. But what I'll share here is that in terms of ownership and accountability, what we suggest, what we recommend, and of course folks can have different models here, is that a service owner should own the postmortem, right? There should always be one owner because there's one place for accountability, right? Now the service owner is the one who's responsible for going out to the incident commander that has the context of the incident, responsible for going out to the change owner, responsible for bringing all these folks together and actually executing and writing the postmortem, right? The manager, director, VP. Now, where does the time allocation come from? Right? You're like, oh, I got all these features to ship, I got all these changes I got to do, I don't have time for this. Okay, well, the manager, the director, the VP owns the time allocation, right? They need to be bought in as to the importance of postmortems, which in most cases they are, in principle they are, And if they are, they need to be the ones making sure that time is being allocated to assigning ownership for the postmortem, right? Ownership gets lost, right? If I tell somebody, I just go to their desk and I'm like, hey, you own the postmortem, it's going to get lost. And we recommend, or what we've seen is that folks will actually create tickets. We've actually seen some very advanced Kanban boards when it comes to doing postmortems, right? So if it's a model that works for you, that's great. One actually really cool model that we've seen, and actually some, again, advanced practitioners within postmortems do this, is that they set up a postmortem guild, right? It's a bunch of folks that come together. It's not just one person who owns the postmortem process, but folks from different teams that really care about the postmortem process, really care about reliability, that come together. You may not be large enough or big enough company to have a problem management team. So how do you bring together your existing team to actually treat postmortems as important, review them for quality, review them for ownership? So that's another way that we've seen folks do this particular part really well. Okay, on-time completion. We'll look at a case study from a Fortune 500 retailer. Okay, on-time completion. Why is it hard? Well, it's just toil. It's toil intensive. You got to write this thing. You got to create tickets. You got to assign those tickets. You got to do the analysis, corral these people together, right, try and figure out. And the other reason is because you have other priorities, right? If you've got the product team that's not bought into reliability and is pushing for, no, we got to push. We promised this thing to a customer, or we've got this deadline we got to meet, or this public launch that's coming up. It's not just shifting priorities on one team, it's shifting priorities across other teams. That's why this thing is extremely hard. So how do we actually make it easy? So here's some practices that we've seen. Again, some of these may seem extreme. Some of them we may endorse, some of them we may not endorse. But some of the cool ones that we found is that block new releases for teams with outstanding postmortem. It's like if you have a culture, again, you've gotten to a point where features take the utmost priority, but reliability needs to take utmost priority as well. Well, how do you actually put a stopgap in place? And what we've seen some companies do is that they will have a report that generates and says, here are all the change owners, here are the outstanding postmortems for them, here are the directors and VPs for them. Their releases are not going out if they have any outstanding high priority postmortems that they need to complete, right? The other thing that we recommend to folks is like, if you're doing it synchronously can sometimes be difficult, although valuable. But you have tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams or Cisco Teams or whatever it is that you're using internally in your company. You've got folks that are living and breathing these tools every day, right? You don't necessarily need to have a live meeting to do these postmortems, right? Just do them on Slack, do them on Microsoft Teams, save yourself time, or at least use that to gather all the information in the right place. We've seen folks allocate time in their sprint. And one extreme example we've seen is escalate to the C-level. It's like, hey, postmortems aren't getting done. We think that we're going to run into this issue again. The risk is really high. We need executive approval to stop these deployments or we need executive approval, executive push to actually do these postmortems. They're extremely important, right? And of course, you can have a much more positive aspect of this, which is gamify it, right? And reward folks for on-time completion. Highlight high-quality postmortems. You can have a scorecard that says, hey, here are the teams that are doing their postmortems in time. Of course, this comes with caveats. Postmortems can be complex. Incidents are complex. It doesn't necessarily mean, but there are ways in which you can gamify and reward folks for doing these postmortems really well. Actually, let me do show of hands. Do folks do any one of these? Actually, let's start with number one. Anybody do block releases if postmortems aren't getting done? Oh, right on. One gentleman. Oh, wow. Folks from Google. Excellent. How about doing them asynchronously, not necessarily via a live meeting? Excellent. Yeah, fair amount. That's great. How many folks actually allocate time within their sprint for great. Wow, hands already went up. That's great. I love it. And then the last one, how many folks actually reward or gamify or have some sort of scorecard or highlight, postmortems for on-time completion quality? One person. Okay, great. As long as there's one. Well, here's just an example. This is something I wanted to pull up to show you like how easy it is, right? If folks here have postmortem templates, whether you're using Google's template, whether you're using your own template, well, you don't need to go into this document to write this stuff. Pull in the right folks and say, hey, Jeff, I need you to go and, since you were the incident commander, please identify the impact, root cause, duration of problem. I'm the postmortem owner here. Morgan, please fill out the following. What was the detection source, blah, blah, blah. Greg, can you fill out? So I can actually corral all this information. It's very low cost for me to do this, right? I didn't need to invite people. I just did this asynchronously. I created a channel. I need to set up a meeting. It's all happening in one location, right? So my point here is that sometimes teams tend to create like this mountain out of a molehill in terms of mental energy and capacity that goes into writing a postmortem. Well, this is a few chat messages I'm assigning folks. I can check in with them. I can use Slack bots or Microsoft bots to actually check in with folks in these channels as well, to just remind them that, hey, this was asked of you. Please come back and fill in this. OK, next one. Context and key details. So we'll look at a Fortune 500 credit card company and some of the challenges that they faced and some really interesting things that they did to actually resolve this data. So OK, context. Usually includes the background, maybe a glossary. The problem with context today is that it's usually tribal knowledge, right? So somebody said, the lady here said, the incident commander or the person on call is the person who has the most context about that incident. Now that person may not even be on the same team as the service owner. You may have a centralized incident command team, incident management team, or a problem management team. Well, if that person is on call or if that person is just pulled into every single incident, well, guess what? They're going to be keeping all that information in their head, right? Outdated documentation. Now, so a lot of folks here, actually, show of hands, have run books for their incidents, right? Somewhat, yeah, about 30% of folks in the room. Documentation gets out of date very quickly. It's hard to keep that documentation up to date, whether it's run books, whether it's, you're putting this into Confluence. Again, if you don't have any referenceability around this data, it gets pretty challenging. And of course, the other problem is team silos, right? Again, you create these localized groups of knowledge. You have the database operations team that's sort of resolving database incidents and just has the knowledge within themselves on how to do those issues. You have the storage team. You have the application owner team. Everybody sort of has their own, and a lot of times using their own systems. We've seen upwards of 30+ DevOps tools, completely different sets. It's the same company using Jira or, ServiceNow, the same company using Confluence and Google Drive, or same company using tool X and tool Y. And that creates another challenge here, is that the team silos means no standardization across the tools. It means that people aren't sharing amongst each other. Same thing applies for key details. So if you're thinking about what was my root cause, the trigger, user impact, mitigation, the metrics, the graphs, the logs that I need to look at, well, this data likely lives in different systems. You're probably using Datadog, New Relic, your own custom monitoring solution here, Splunk, Elk Stack, whatever it is. That context, those key details live across all these different systems, right? Sometimes those details live in different brains, which I talked about before. And of course, not having SLOs really makes it hard to understand like what is actually important. What is a metric that we use to measure reliability? Well, if we don't have SLOs, we likely have an SLA, right? Maybe that's the right metric, but we actually know as SREs that the SLA is not the right metric to measure reliability. It's one number that's supposed to represent everything. So we try and mash everything into this thing. So if you don't have SLOs in place, you really don't have a high-level mechanism that helps you reason reliability, right? And especially when you're trying to understand root cause. So if I say there's a difference between, I impacted 30% of my users in the European region. Well, it's different than me saying I consumed 80% of my air budget because of this incident in the European region. Those two things will evoke different reactions, different flows, different actions. Okay, so how do we actually make some of this easy? So the incident commander, or the person who's on call for that particular incident, their job should or can be, instead of them, herding cats during this incident, at the end, it's the incident commander's job is to corral all of the content and key details and hand off to the postmortem owner, or vice versa, right? It's the postmortem owner's responsibility to reach out to the person that has the context, pull that information in ASAP, do it over Slack again, do it over Microsoft Teams, whatever chat system you have. But let's collect that information as quickly as possible. Try and keep all the details in one place. Whether you're using a chat system, a data warehouse, whatever it is, force yourself, right? Force yourself to say, okay, we're going to try and avoid having conversations over Zoom or Google Hangouts or Cisco WebEx. We're going to try and scribe that data into whatever system that we're using, right? Set up one-on-one interviews with incident attendees ASAP, right? This could be done by with the help of the incident commander, but the postmortem owner really takes charge of this, which is, I'm going to talk to a bunch of people that were involved, the folks that were key to this incident resolution, set up interviews with them, and really understand what the key details are, what was the context of this, and start documenting it, right? And again, try and force the conversations to happen in a place where you can documentation. Now, the documentation, I want to be very clear, is not meant for blame, right? It is purely a mechanism to help you corral the context, get the key details, so it's going to make you better when you do your postmortems, right? But please do not use this as a mechanism for blame. This is a tough one. So we'll talk about action items created and tracked to completion. We'll look at a mid-size IaaS provider and some of the things that they did here. And what makes this hard is that, as I mentioned, action items actually end up being in different systems. How many folks here use just Jira? One. Just ServiceNow, only ServiceNow. Only ServiceNow, okay, great. How about both? Remedy, ServiceNow, Jira, one or multiple systems. It's actually a relative majority of people that have multiple systems, right? So these action items, there's action items that are in the incident follow-up action items that are happening inside ServiceNow. Then you have these post-mortem follow-up actions. You're like, oh, the developers use Jira, so we're going to move those action items into Jira. Well, how are you, putting those two things together? You've immediately lost coherency between those two systems and the action items that you're creating. Right? A lot of times, because it's so toil-intensive to create these action items, well, they don't usually get tagged. You're like, oh, I just got to create this action item. I'm going to clone this ticket again and again and again because I've seen it so many times. And they don't get tagged. And they end up getting buried. So who's actually going to go back and say, 3 months later, you see this ticket in your backlog, and you're like, I don't really know why I have this ticket in my backlog. Since it doesn't seem like a priority, I'm just going to punt it to next sprint and punt it to next sprint. And then you have a meeting 6 months later that says, oh, we have this backlog. Let's just flush those backlog items. It doesn't seem like they're important, right? And then you have another issue, another incident. Sometimes these action items, it's hard to understand. If you don't prioritize them and you don't have the right language associated with them, well, again, as I mentioned, what are you going to actually work on? And this is something that we've seen, which is that these action items end up being tracked manually. And what I mean by that is you have one or many individuals, sometimes a problem management team, which the sole responsibility is to create these action items for people and then just track them, right? So you have multiple people, multiple headcount that's just dedicated to tracking these things. And the tooling is not necessarily set up to actually help you generate the reports accurately. Again, because you got to go generate one in ServiceNow, you got to go generate one in Remedy, you got to go generate one in Jira. So who's going to do that work? This is actually extremely painful. So how do we make it easy? Well, try and use one ticketing system. I know a lot of people don't want to hear this, but again, we've had companies that will shift away either to, let's say, completely to ServiceNow, completely to Jira. Try and use one, at least for the follow-up action items, commit to saying we're still gonna use one system for, let's say, the high-level incident tickets, but the follow-up action items must and always go into, let's say, a Jira or Freshworks or whatever system that you're using, right? use tags. Every one of these systems has some notion of tagging, and they're simple. You just click a button, type one word, and that one word, I promise you, I guarantee you, when you do a search 3 months later, you're gonna thank yourself, like, wow, I'm so glad that this change was related to incident 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that had a SEV0 or SLO impact of 95% or whatever. Right? If you don't have SLOs, this may not apply, but this is also a great opportunity. So this was an opportunity for folks to, because they were having so much trouble actually creating these action items, tracking them, and prioritizing them, to say, okay, we're just going to force one SLO for one service onto this. This is an opportunity. This is a forcing function for us to actually start having SLOs. So it had kind of the opposite effect. It was a bottoms-up approach, and you didn't need to get buy-in from the top. It's like, okay, we're just going to say SLO. We're going to set up a quick SLO for this service. We're going to look at what the impact of on the SLO was, and then we're going to attach that SLO impact to the ticket. And that made a world of a difference, right? This one I am personally not a big fan of, and I'll tell you why. But it is a very common practice, which is write some script. You have these systems that can generate these daily outstanding reports. The anti-pattern that we've seen here is that you have an email that goes out every day, every other day, or every week that says, here are all the outstanding postmortems. Here are the managers that are responsible for it. Here are the directors. Their names are being called out, right? So then that puts them into panic mode, and they're like, oh, I don't want my name on this list, so I'm gonna go and choke some folks on my team and be like, oh, it's the wrong behavior, right? But if you can do this if you have the right culture in your company, right? They're like, hey, we're kind of blameless, we're doing this for accountability purposes, it's okay for us to generate this report. Okay, I think this is the final one. Blameless language, this is one of my favorite ones. And we found this pattern in hypergrowth companies that are growing extremely quickly. And the reason why is because there's this mentality of push, 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 move extremely fast, which means that we will drop things on the floor, cut corners when it comes to focusing on sensitive language. So we're just going to be like, oh, Ashar was the one who pushed this change, and he's been fired, or he's been taken care of, right? There is actually one example that's publicly, I won't call out the name of the company, but very, very fast-growing company, in the data management space. They had a security incident, and you look at their public postmortem, and clearly they said, this developer made this change, and that actually caused this issue, right? So those are the kinds of things that you want to avoid, because folks that are going to read this, or recruits, folks that want to come join your company, like, wow, they just called out a developer. They're not acknowledging any responsibility, taking any responsibility. That could be me. I don't want to work here, right? But it happens in these hypergrowth startups. They don't necessarily have the maturity or expertise, but more importantly, the culture is all about push, 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 and less about reliability. But we'll talk about what are some of the things that we've seen. Well, sometimes English is not necessarily the first language for folks, right? So it's like no one's fault, right? If we're calling folks out or using sometimes subjective or emotional language, it's okay, because folks don't necessarily come from an English as a first language background, right? It is actually easier to call out an individual and team and to pass blame onto somebody else. It was not me. I'm this high and mighty person, and I'm going to sit on this pedestal, and I'm going to say it's Team X, your fault. I'm the incident, and it's Team Y, it's your fault. Some folks like that, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to call people out. But at the core of it is that you don't have a culture of psychological safety, right? It's not okay to make mistakes is really the kind of culture that exists, and that's something that is harder to break, but definitely can change, and we've seen that. Okay, well, I'm telling you now, and hopefully you can learn and take this away from you. Don't call out individuals. If you have to, use initials. Move away from one root cause. There's debate in the industry around one root cause versus contributing factors. Don't write personal judgments. And always ask, start the question with, where did the system fail, right? The system is this abstract machine thing that you can pass all the blame onto and not necessarily have individuals that get impacted. Okay, last one, referenceability. Case study, everyone. Referenceability is hard across the board. It's hard to capture structured data, or unstructured data, excuse me. Postmortem data lives in different systems. They use different templates, methodologies. There really isn't an incentive to do this well. It's still hard, unfortunately, right? People are still figuring this out. Okay, so what could we do? Well, standardize on using some templates. Use Google, so just use one, pick one. Use Google, LinkedIn, whatever's out there publicly, just start. Have all postmortems in one place that has some level of searchability, indexability, whatever it is. Some really cool hacks that we've seen is that people have taken and tried to fit their postmortems into log file formats, put them into their indexing system like Splunk or Elk or whatever, and they're like, oh, I'm just going to use, and mixed results. Yeah, or you could just hire temps, interns to scrape the data. That's kind of mean. Right? So some unsolved postmortem problems, really no clear answer, right? Asynchronous versus synchronous. Do them in meetings, do them in Slack. Doesn't really matter, whatever works for you, right? When do you declare a postmortem complete? Is it when you're done with all of the action items? Is it when you're done with the timeline? Is it when there's debate on this as well. Referenceability is, again, a big pain point. And knowledge extraction. Once you've got this amazing database of learnings, how do you quickly extract that in the next incident and use it? How do you quickly extract that in the next SLO meeting that you're doing in front of your executives and use that data? Some quick highlights. Obviously, skipped a bunch of things here, but clear roles and responsibilities, reward good behavior, set SLOs, don't call people out, so on. When things are working, you'll start to notice less blame, more psychological safety, less burnout, right? People will spend more time working on cool features. There's less panic because you've kind of gone through this multiple times. You know, you have that knowledge, you've built that muscle, so you're going to use it. And happier customers through continuous improvement and faster delivery. So, for folks in the room, no excuses. Hopefully I have given you no excuses not to do postmortems. Please do them well. Share with each other, share with folks in the industry, talk to people, use best practices. It's not that hard. There's just no excuses not to do them. And I'll just quickly end, I have 1 minute? Okay, quickly end with a tale of two blames, but I'm going to actually just do one blame, which was a company that I work with, and I'd love after this meeting to hear more horror stories or great stories. This is a good story where I work for a company. The first incident that I was personally responsible for, or I had caused, was IPO day, 9 a.m. in the morning, ringing the bell, and I had a real user monitoring script that would hit our API, and it would upload files and download files and update a database. And I had this thing running for months, and it had, in the root folder of this database, which is how kind of the mapping worked, millions of files. So we were having another issue, some performance degradation. I was like, oh, I'm going to log in, and I'm going to log into this thing, and I'm going to see what my script is doing. As soon as I log in, the database crashes. And the entire site goes offline on IPO day. So the question is, what am I doing here? How did I survive that? Right? Well, culture of psychological safety. No blame was associated to an individual, in this case me. We had a blameless postmortem. We talked about the systemic failure. We talked about recovering. It's a great day for IPO. We popped 30% and then dropped down 50% for like the next 3 years, but that's a different issue. But I did want to talk about, like, you could have extremely severe issues. You could feel that, and it's okay to feel that fear, right? Because we as professionals, we as individuals that really care about what we do feel that fear, but it should not be a fear of getting fired and you're not necessarily working at the right company. It should be a fear of not being able to do better or not being able to learn. So I'm standing here in front of you having experienced not just one incident like that, but multiple things that folks would consider company-ending events, but those companies are doing really well. I'm standing here in front of you talking about some of these learnings here, so I highly encourage folks to take away the importance of blameless postmortems, and of course, hopefully there's content here that's helpful, that makes it easy for folks to do it. All right? Well, thank you very much. How much time do we have? 5 minutes? Okay, yeah, happy. Questions? Any questions? Anybody want to share? So we'll do questions. Also happy to, if anybody wants to share horror stories, incident or postmortem horror stories, please come and do so as well.
So one question I have.
Oh, yeah, it goes on the recording supposedly what you just had to talk about.
Okay, I can do that. So have you ever encountered an organization that does too many postmortems? And if you have, how would you recommend dealing with that?
That's a great question. Let me repeat the question for folks here. Have we ever encountered an organization that does too many postmortems? I would say we haven't. So let me put it this way. We've encountered an organization that has tried to do too many postmortems, but there's just been a massive revolt, right? And usually, again, as I mentioned, the problems, the systems are not set up necessarily to be able to do that many postmortems. So for example, postmortems will get narrowed down to just SEV0 or SEV1 incidents, which I also think is a little bit of an anti-pattern. The thing that we've seen actually work is, I think they use the word micro postmortems or just like postmortems light, which is we have these SEV2, SEV3 incidents. We care about the impact of these incidents. We don't need to do an in-depth analysis at this point. Maybe after 10 or 15 of these we can. But let's actually do capture the learning. Let's do 5 or 10 of those postmortem fields, no more than 2 hours to spend on this in the entire week, and get it done. That's kind of been the middle ground of what we've seen that works. Right? Most companies, they struggle just getting their postmortems in place. We would like to see more of them happen, but at the same time, you want to be cognizant that you don't want to be burdened too much. So use this thing called micro PMs, which is just a light version of doing a postmortem.
Hi. So one of the major challenge I see in Blameless Postmortem is KPI. So each of the team, they will set a certain KPI for themselves. For example, the network team will say that for the next year, let's have half of the incidents that we have. So I think that is something that is really affecting this whole Blameless Postmortem thing. And I don't see that in your presentations. So do you think KPI is one of the roadblocks?
When you say, could you give me a little bit more detail on when you say KPI? Do you mean that you have KPIs for incidents?
Yep, that's right.
So if I'm reading this correctly, next year we're only going to have 10 incidents.
Yeah.
Right. Well, quite honestly, I think that's a really great call out. My recommendation is that assigning a KPI to something, it's like incidents. You're assuming that incidents, it's a force you can foresee into the future how many incidents that you're going to have. I think what we've seen is that if you do incident management well, what you end up seeing is an increase in the number of incidents because you want to track everything, right? Even low severity incidents, you're like, wow, we're actually getting so much benefit from the incident process, from the postmortem process, that we want to actually take our low severity incidents and actually track them. So it's actually the opposite, which is you don't actually want to set a KPI for, oh, we're only going to have 5 SEV0s or 3 SEV0s or 2 SEV0s. I think that may be an anti-pattern. But what I do recommend, or what we've seen, is that if you're doing incident management well, regardless of the severity, it should go through that ICS process because it brings people together, you collect all the data, you have a systematic approach to resolving that incident, and you're actually going to see the number of incidents go up and then plateau at some point in time. Yes. So doing a KPI like that, what I would recommend instead is, if you're talking about incidents and setting a KPI, what you're actually trying to do is to say, we want to be more reliable, right? And for that, you should probably have SLOs. Right? And setting SLOs is actually the better way to measure reliability and decide what you're going to work on, what you're not going to work on. Right?